The silence in the federal courtroom was so thick you could cut it with a knife when Judge Anthony Trenga's mocking laughter suddenly erupted like thunder. His voice boomed through the marble halls of the Eastern District of Virginia as he pointed his finger directly at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, barely able to contain his amusement. "Congresswoman, are you seriously suggesting that this court should entertain such theatrical accusations?" Trenga chuckled, his words dripping with the kind of arrogance that comes from decades of unchallenged power. The packed gallery watched in stunned silence as one of America's most feared federal judges openly ridiculed a sitting member of Congress who also happened to be one of the nation's most brilliant legal minds. For the past hour, Trenga had been systematically dismantling Crockett's arguments in a high-stakes corruption case that could have sent shockwaves through Washington's power elite. Every legal motion she presented, every piece of evidence she offered, every constitutional argument she made was met with the same condescending smirk and dismissive wave of his hand. The spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats as they witnessed what appeared to be a masterclass in judicial humiliation. Several prominent attorneys in the gallery exchanged worried glances, recognizing they were watching something unprecedented. A federal judge who seemed to take genuine pleasure in publicly destroying the credibility of one of Congress's most respected legal advocates. But what Judge Trenga didn't know, what none of the 200 people packed into that courtroom could have possibly imagined, was that Congresswoman Crockett had been planning this moment for 6 months. Hidden beneath her calm exterior and behind her methodical legal arguments was a secret investigation that had uncovered something so explosive, so career-destroying, so absolutely devastating that it would not only silence Trenga's arrogant laughter forever but would ultimately force him to flee the federal bench in disgrace. The black leather portfolio sitting innocently on her table contained documents that would expose a web of corruption reaching into the highest levels of the American justice system. Documents that would prove Judge Anthony Trenga had been selling justice to the highest bidder for over a decade. What happened next didn't just change the outcome of one case. It triggered the largest judicial corruption scandal in modern American history, brought down a network of corrupt officials across 3 states, and turned Jasmine Crockett into a national hero who proved that even the most powerful figures in America are not above the law. The final folder that Crockett was about to open contained evidence so damning that legal experts are still calling it the most devastating judicial takedown ever captured on court record. If you've ever felt powerless watching corrupt officials abuse their authority while ordinary people suffer the consequences, what you're about to witness will restore your faith that justice can still prevail against even the most entrenched corruption. Hit that like button and subscribe right now, because what Congresswoman Crockett pulled from that final portfolio didn't just expose one corrupt judge, it unraveled a criminal conspiracy that had been rigging cases, stealing millions in taxpayer money, and denying justice to countless victims for over 15 years. This isn't just another political story that gets forgotten in a week. This is the moment when one woman's courage and brilliant detective work brought down an entire network of corruption that reaches into corporate boardrooms, political back rooms, and judicial chambers across multiple states. The evidence Crockett was about to reveal would force 3 federal judges into early retirement, trigger FBI raids on 2 major law firms, lead to criminal indictments of 7 high-ranking officials, and result in the largest judicial ethics investigation in United States history. But more importantly, it would prove that when someone with enough determination and legal brilliance decides to take on the system, even the most powerful and arrogant figures can be brought to justice. To understand how this single courtroom confrontation became the catalyst for the most comprehensive cleanup of judicial corruption in modern times, we need to understand exactly who these 2 figures are and why their explosive clash was inevitable from the moment Crockett discovered the truth about Anthony Trenga's secret criminal empire. Judge Anthony Trenga wasn't just any federal judge. He was a man who had turned the sacred halls of justice into his personal money-making machine. At 71 years old, Trenga had spent the last 16 years on the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia, but what the legal community didn't know was that behind his respected judicial robes lay one of the most sophisticated corruption schemes ever operated from a federal bench. Appointed by President George W. Bush in 2008, Trenga had used his Georgetown law degree and connections from his previous career at Morrison & Foerster, one of Virginia's most elite law firms, to build what investigators would later call a judicial ATM machine. His reputation among Virginia's legal elite was that of a brilliant but ruthlessly ambitious judge who never forgot a favor and always collected his debts. What made Trenga particularly dangerous was his ability to hide his corruption behind a veneer of legal respectability and conservative judicial philosophy. He was known for running an extremely tight courtroom where he tolerated no dissent and showed particular hostility toward civil rights attorneys and anyone who dared challenge corporate power. Over the years, he had developed a network of wealthy donors, corporate executives, and political operatives who had learned they could count on favorable rulings as long as they continued feeding money into Trenga's elaborate web of shell companies and offshore accounts. The case that would ultimately expose his criminal empire involved a massive government contracting fraud, but Trenga had already signaled to the defendants that he would make their legal problems disappear for the right price. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett represented everything that terrified corrupt officials like Anthony Trenga. Now serving her second term representing Texas, Crockett had built her entire career around one simple principle: powerful people who abuse their positions should face the full consequences of their actions, no matter how high their office or how deep their connections. Before entering Congress, she had spent 15 years as a prosecutor and civil rights attorney, earning a reputation as the lawyer that corrupt officials feared most. Her colleagues at the University of Houston Law Center had nicknamed her the Closer because of her uncanny ability to uncover evidence that others missed and her relentless pursuit of justice even when facing seemingly impossible odds. What made Crockett uniquely qualified to take down someone like Trenga was her background in financial crimes and her expertise in following money trails through complex corporate structures. During her years in private practice, she had specialized in cases involving judicial corruption and had developed an extensive network of whistleblowers, forensic accountants, and investigative journalists who trusted her completely. Unknown to Judge Trenga, Crockett had been building a case against him for months, using her congressional resources and private contacts to trace millions of dollars in suspicious financial transactions that all led back to his courtroom. She had maintained her legal credentials specifically for cases like this, situations where the corruption was so deep and the stakes so high that only someone with her unique combination of legal expertise and political protection could take on the challenge. The stage for their epic confrontation had been set 6 months earlier when a whistleblower from the defendant's accounting firm had contacted Crockett's office with evidence of payments being made to shell companies connected to Judge Trenga. What started as a tip about one suspicious payment had evolved into a comprehensive investigation that revealed Trenga had been taking bribes, manipulating case assignments, and coordinating with defense attorneys to ensure favorable outcomes for anyone willing to pay his price. Crockett knew that exposing Trenga would require perfect timing, ironclad evidence, and the element of complete surprise. She also knew that if she failed, Trenga's powerful connections could destroy her career and possibly even threaten her safety. But what she discovered in her investigation was so shocking, so far-reaching, and so dangerous to the integrity of the entire federal court system that she had no choice but to act, regardless of the personal cost. The case that would bring down Anthony Trenga's criminal empire began with what appeared to be a routine government contracting dispute, but beneath the surface lay a conspiracy worth over $200 million in stolen taxpayer money. Meridian Defense Solutions, a military contractor accused of overcharging the Pentagon for equipment that was never delivered, had been facing a federal investigation that should have resulted in massive criminal penalties and the complete destruction of their business. Instead, through a series of suspicious legal maneuvers and favorable rulings from Judge Trenga's court, the case had been systematically weakened to the point where Meridian was likely to escape with nothing more than a slap on the wrist and a small fine that represented less than 1% of their stolen profits. What triggered Crockett's involvement was a pattern that experienced prosecutors recognize as the hallmark of judicial corruption: outcomes that make no legal sense unless someone is being paid to ignore the evidence. When Trenga dismissed key evidence against Meridian on questionable procedural grounds, excluded testimony from 3 whistleblowing employees, and granted motions that directly contradicted his own previous rulings, veteran Justice Department attorneys began asking questions. The case had attracted national attention because it involved equipment failures that had put American soldiers at risk, and victim families had specifically requested that Crockett use her congressional oversight authority to investigate why justice was being denied. What she discovered during her preliminary review was so alarming that she made the unprecedented decision to personally join the prosecution team as a special counsel. The trap for Trenga was set when Crockett's team filed a motion to introduce newly discovered evidence showing the full scope of Meridian's fraud, including documentation that the company had been deliberately supplying defective equipment while charging premium prices for superior products. Trenga had already signaled to Meridian's attorneys that he would reject this motion, confident that his usual tactics of procedural dismissals and evidence exclusions would protect his criminal partners. What he didn't know was that Crockett had spent months documenting every suspicious ruling, every questionable decision, and every financial transaction that connected his courtroom to Meridian's bank accounts. She had also been secretly recording conversations with court personnel who had witnessed Trenga's private meetings with defense attorneys and his explicit instructions to court clerks about which evidence should be accidentally misfiled or delayed. The morning of the confrontation, legal observers expected a routine hearing where Trenga would once again protect Meridian from accountability while Crockett made futile arguments about justice and transparency. None of them anticipated that Crockett had coordinated her courtroom appearance with simultaneous FBI raids on 3 different locations connected to Trenga's corruption network, or that federal agents were already in position around the courthouse with arrest warrants for several of Trenga's co-conspirators. The black portfolio on Crockett's table contained not just evidence of Trenga's crimes, but also real-time updates from FBI agents who were at that very moment seizing financial records, computer files, and communications that would prove Trenga had been operating a criminal enterprise from his federal courtroom for over a decade. If you're finding this investigation into high-level corruption as shocking as we are, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We're bringing you the kind of deep investigative content that exposes how power really works in America, and your support helps us continue this crucial work of holding the powerful accountable. The evidence that Crockett was about to present wouldn't just change the outcome of the Meridian case. It would trigger a complete investigation into every decision Trenga had made as a federal judge and expose a network of corruption that reached into some of the most powerful institutions in America. The atmosphere in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia was electric that Tuesday morning as news had leaked that Congresswoman Crockett would be personally arguing a case that could expose massive government contracting fraud. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity with reporters, law students, Justice Department officials, and family members of soldiers who had been endangered by Meridian's defective equipment. Extra security had been stationed throughout the building, though most observers assumed it was simply due to Crockett's high-profile status rather than the criminal takedown that was about to unfold. The mahogany-paneled courtroom buzzed with anticipation as everyone waited to see how Judge Trenga would handle what many expected to be a politically charged confrontation. When the bailiff called "All rise," and Judge Trenga entered wearing his black judicial robes, His demeanor was that of a man completely confident in his ability to control the proceedings. He surveyed the packed gallery with the slight smirk that had become his trademark, clearly relishing the attention and the opportunity to demonstrate his power in front of such a distinguished audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Trenga announced as he settled into his elevated chair, "we are here today to consider the plaintiff's motion to introduce additional evidence in the matter of United States versus Meridian Defense Solutions. I must say, it's quite unusual to have a sitting member of Congress appear in my courtroom, but I suppose we should all feel honored by Congresswoman Crockett's presence." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, and several reporters exchanged glances as they recognized the tone of a judge who clearly believed he held all the cards. Trenga continued his opening remarks with barely concealed amusement. "I've reviewed the motion in question, and I must say that I'm somewhat puzzled by the legal theories being advanced. But please, Congresswoman, enlighten us with your arguments." Crockett rose from the plaintiff's table with calm dignity, her expression professional and composed despite the judge's obvious attempt to diminish her credibility before she had even spoken. For the next 20 minutes, she presented a methodical and devastating case for admitting evidence that would prove Meridian had deliberately defrauded the government while endangering American military personnel overseas. Her presentation was a masterclass in legal advocacy, citing specific federal regulations, relevant case precedents, and procedural rules with the precision that comes from decades of courtroom experience. Every attorney in the gallery could tell that Crockett wasn't just well-prepared, she was operating at a level of legal expertise that rivaled the most accomplished federal prosecutors in the country. She detailed how Meridian had submitted false certifications, provided fraudulent test results, and deliberately concealed safety defects that had already resulted in equipment failures in combat zones. The evidence she sought to introduce included internal company emails, whistleblower testimony, and independent laboratory tests that would prove Meridian's systematic fraud beyond any reasonable doubt. But Judge Trenga's response revealed exactly why Crockett had suspected his involvement in the conspiracy from the beginning. Rather than engaging with her legal arguments or asking substantive questions about the evidence, Trenga began interrupting her presentation with increasingly hostile and dismissive comments. "Congresswoman, while your passion for this case is evident, I'm concerned that you may be allowing political considerations to cloud your legal judgment," he said with a tone that suggested he was speaking to a first-year law student rather than an accomplished attorney and sitting member of Congress. The gallery shifted uncomfortably as they witnessed what appeared to be an unprofessional attack on Crockett's competence and motives. As Crockett continued her presentation, Trenga's interruptions became more frequent and more pointed, clearly designed to throw her off balance and undermine her credibility in front of the packed courtroom. "I'm wondering, Congresswoman, if your experience in criminal defense work has adequately prepared you for the complexities of federal civil procedure," he said with a smirk that suggested he already knew the answer. Several law professors in the gallery later described feeling uncomfortable with the judge's obvious bias and unprofessional conduct, but none of them could have anticipated that they were witnessing the opening moves in what would become the most spectacular judicial downfall in modern American history. Crockett remained composed throughout Trenga's attacks, methodically building her case while secretly waiting for the perfect moment to spring the trap that would end his criminal career forever. Judge Trenga's arrogance reached its peak as he leaned back in his chair, his voice taking on the mocking tone that would soon be replayed millions of times across social media and news broadcasts. "Congresswoman Crockett, I have to ask you a serious question," he said, pausing dramatically for effect while his eyes gleamed with malicious amusement. "Did you perhaps confuse my federal courtroom with one of your congressional committee hearings? Because what you're presenting here today seems more suited for political theater than serious legal proceedings." His laughter began as a low chuckle but grew louder and more pronounced as he clearly enjoyed what he believed was his masterful humiliation of one of Congress's most respected members. The cruelty of the moment was breathtaking, and the entire courtroom fell into uncomfortable silence as they witnessed a federal judge openly mocking a sitting congresswoman who was also a highly accomplished attorney. Several reporters began frantically taking notes, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in American judicial history. Trenga's laughter echoed off the marble walls as he continued his attack. "Perhaps, Congresswoman, you should stick to making speeches on C-SPAN and leave the practice of federal law to those of us who actually understand how real courts operate." The defense attorneys for Meridian were barely concealing their satisfaction, clearly believing that their paid judge was successfully destroying Crockett's credibility in front of the national media. But what none of them realized was that every word of Trenga's mocking performance was being recorded not just by court reporters, but by hidden federal surveillance equipment that had been installed in the courtroom as part of the FBI's ongoing investigation into his corruption network. Crockett remained absolutely calm throughout the humiliating attack, though those closest to her noticed that she had quietly placed her hand on a thick black folder that she hadn't yet opened. Her voice remained steady and professional as she responded, "Your Honor, I appreciate your concerns about my qualifications, but I should mention that before serving in Congress, I successfully prosecuted over 200 federal cases, including 15 that involved judicial corruption." The room went dead silent at her mention of judicial corruption cases, and for the first time, Judge Trenga's confident smirk flickered slightly. But his arrogance quickly returned as he dismissed her implied threat with another round of condescending laughter. "How fascinating, Congresswoman. And I suppose you believe that experience makes you qualified to lecture me about how to run my courtroom." His voice dripped with sarcasm as he gestured broadly to emphasize his point. "Let me remind you that I have been serving on the federal bench for 16 years, and in all that time, I have never encountered such a blatant attempt to turn legal proceedings into a political circus." It was at this moment of peak humiliation, with Trenga's mocking laughter filling the courtroom and his apparent victory seeming complete, that Crockett made a statement that would change everything. "Your Honor, before you rule on our motion to admit this evidence about Meridian's fraud, I believe there's something else the court should consider." Her voice cut through Trenga's laughter like a knife, and the sudden seriousness of her tone caused an immediate shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. "I have here documentation that directly relates to this case and to Your Honor's ability to fairly adjudicate these proceedings." Judge Trenga's laughter died instantly as he saw the deadly serious expression on Crockett's face and noticed that she was now holding what appeared to be a substantial file folder. The confidence that had defined his demeanor throughout the morning suddenly wavered as he realized that something had fundamentally changed in the dynamic of their confrontation. "What exactly are you suggesting, Congresswoman?" he asked, his voice no longer carrying the mocking tone but instead betraying the first hint of uncertainty and concern. The packed courtroom held its collective breath as they sensed that they were about to witness something extraordinary, though none of them could have imagined the magnitude of the revelation that was about to unfold. The transformation in the courtroom atmosphere was instantaneous and electric as Congresswoman Crockett opened the black folder with deliberate precision, her movements slow and calculated like a master chess player making the final move that would end the game. "Your Honor, this folder contains financial records obtained through a 6-month federal investigation conducted jointly by the FBI Financial Crimes Unit, the Treasury Department's Financial Intelligence Unit, and the Congressional Ethics Office," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who held absolute proof of devastating crimes. Judge Trenga's face went from confident amusement to visible alarm in the span of seconds as the implications of her words began to sink in. "Specifically, Your Honor, these documents detail a sophisticated money laundering operation involving offshore shell companies, cryptocurrency transactions, and systematic bribery that has generated over $12 million in illegal payments to you personally over the past 8 years, Crockett continued, placing the first set of documents on the court clerk's desk. The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispered conversations as the magnitude of her allegations became clear. Trenga's hands visibly trembled as he stammered, "Congresswoman, these are outrageous accusations that have absolutely no basis in reality. I demand that you cease this character assassination immediately." But Crockett was just getting started, and her next revelation would prove that she had been building an ironclad case that would destroy not just Trenga's career but expose an entire criminal network. "Your Honor, I'm afraid the evidence is quite comprehensive. For example, this document shows a $340,000 wire transfer from Meridian Defense Solutions to Cayman Islands Trust Company on March 15th of last year, the same day you issued a ruling dismissing key fraud evidence against them." She produced a bank record and handed it to the stunned court clerk. "This second document shows that exactly 48 hours later, $340,000 was transferred from that same Cayman account to your personal investment portfolio managed by Blackstone Financial Services." The defense attorneys for Meridian were now frantically whispering among themselves, clearly realizing that their entire legal strategy had been built around a judge who was about to be exposed as a criminal co-conspirator. Trenga's face had gone completely pale as he stared at the financial documents that proved his corruption beyond any doubt. "Where did you obtain these private financial records?" he demanded, his voice cracking with desperation. "These documents are protected by banking privacy laws and could not have been legally obtained." Crockett's response revealed the true scope of the federal investigation that had been building around Trenga for months. "Your Honor, these records were obtained through valid federal warrants issued by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court as part of a national security investigation into foreign corruption of American judicial officials," she explained with devastating calm. "The investigation began when Treasury Department algorithms detected unusual cryptocurrency transactions flowing from companies with pending cases in your court to accounts controlled by you and your immediate family members." The courtroom fell into stunned silence as Crockett produced document after document proving that Trenga had been operating what federal investigators called a judicial pay-to-play scheme that had corrupted dozens of major cases over nearly a decade. This spreadsheet, compiled by FBI forensic accountants, shows 47 separate cases where companies paid bribes to accounts controlled by you or your wife, followed by favorable rulings that saved those companies a combined total of over $800 million in penalties, fines, and damage awards, she continued, her voice steady despite the earth-shaking nature of her revelations. But the most devastating blow was yet to come, and when Crockett revealed the final piece of evidence, it became clear that Trenga's corruption had endangered national security itself. "Your Honor, this final document will explain why federal agents are currently executing search warrants at your home, your wife's business, and the offices of Morrison and Forster law firm," she announced as she produced a classified intelligence briefing. "It appears that some of the companies paying bribes to your court were actually front organizations for foreign intelligence services, meaning that your corruption may have compromised classified government contracts and endangered American military operations overseas." The courtroom erupted in chaos as reporters rushed to file breaking news alerts and spectators struggled to process the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. Judge Trenga sat in his chair like a broken man, the arrogance and confidence that had defined his career replaced by the hollow stare of someone watching his entire world collapse in real time. Federal marshals had quietly positioned themselves at the courtroom exits, and it was clear that Trenga's judicial career was over and his criminal prosecution was about to begin. The man who had mocked Congresswoman Crockett just minutes earlier was now facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in federal prison for corruption, money laundering, and potentially treason. The silence that followed Crockett's devastating revelations was unlike anything anyone in that courtroom had ever experienced. It was the sound of a powerful man's entire world crashing down in real time while 200 witnesses watched in stunned disbelief. Judge Anthony Trenga sat motionless in his elevated chair, his face ashen and his hands trembling uncontrollably as the full weight of his exposure settled over him like a death shroud. The man who had entered the courtroom that morning with supreme confidence and mocking laughter was now staring into the abyss of federal prison, disgrace, and the complete destruction of everything he had built over his decades-long career. For nearly 5 minutes, Trenga said nothing, his eyes darting between the damning financial documents spread before him and the packed gallery of reporters, attorneys, and spectators who were witnessing his complete humiliation. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, a stark contrast to the booming, condescending tone that had characterized his earlier performance. "This court will take an immediate recess," he stammered, his words barely audible over the growing murmur of shocked conversations throughout the courtroom. I need to consult with..." His voice trailed off as he seemed to realize that there was no consultation that could save him from the overwhelming evidence of his crimes. As Trenga struggled to his feet, his judicial robes seeming to weigh him down like chains, federal marshals stepped forward with a coordinated precision that made it clear this moment had been carefully planned. "Your Honor," the lead marshal announced in a voice that carried throughout the silent courtroom, "we have been instructed to inform you that you are now the subject of an active federal criminal investigation. You have the right to legal representation, and we strongly advise you to contact an attorney immediately." The formal language couldn't disguise the fact that one of America's most powerful federal judges was being treated like any other criminal suspect. The courtroom erupted into controlled chaos as Trenga made his walk of shame toward his chambers, photographers capturing every step of his humiliating exit while reporters frantically called their newsrooms with updates on what was already being called the biggest judicial corruption scandal in American history. Several law students later described feeling sick to their stomachs as they watched a federal judge, someone they had been taught to respect as the embodiment of justice itself, revealed as a common criminal who had sold his oath and his country for money. Within minutes of Trenga's exit, Chief Judge Rebecca Hollis entered the courtroom with an expression of grim determination that made it clear the federal judiciary was moving quickly to contain the damage from this unprecedented scandal. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the packed gallery, "Judge Trenga has been immediately suspended from all judicial duties pending the outcome of federal criminal investigations. This case, along with every case he has presided over in the past 5 years, will be reviewed for potential corruption and misconduct." Her words sent shockwaves through the legal community as attorneys realized that hundreds of cases worth billions of dollars might need to be completely relitigated. The immediate practical consequences were staggering as Chief Judge Hollis continued her emergency announcements. "Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate sequestration of all financial records, communication devices, and case files associated with Judge Trenga's chambers. Federal agents are currently executing search warrants at multiple locations, and we expect additional arrests to be made as this investigation expands." The revelation that more arrests were coming sent a wave of panic through the defense attorneys in the gallery, many of whom were now wondering if their own communications with Trenga's court had made them unwitting participants in his criminal conspiracy. For Congresswoman Crockett, the moment represented not just a personal victory but vindication of her months-long investigation and her unwavering belief that no one, regardless of their position or power, should be above the law. As she gathered her documents and prepared to leave the courtroom, she was surrounded by reporters demanding to know how she had uncovered such extensive evidence of corruption. "The American people deserve to know that their justice system works for everyone, not just those wealthy enough to buy favorable rulings," she said with quiet dignity. Today's revelations are just the beginning of what I believe will be a comprehensive cleanup of corruption that has infected our federal courts for far too long. The final image that would be seared into the memory of everyone present was that of Trenga's empty judicial chair, the symbol of his authority now vacant and his nameplate already being removed by court personnel. Where just hours earlier sat a man who believed himself untouchable, there was now only emptiness, a fitting metaphor for the hollow corruption that had defined his career and the justice that had finally caught up with him. The laughter that had echoed through that courtroom would be the last sound of Trenga's judicial career, replaced by the silence of disgrace and the certainty of criminal prosecution. The explosion of media coverage was immediate and relentless as every major news outlet led with headlines about the federal judge who had been exposed as a criminal mastermind by a congresswoman he had mocked just hours earlier. Within 24 hours, Judge Trenga corruption scandal was the top trending topic across all social media platforms, with millions of Americans sharing clips of his arrogant laughter followed by his humiliating downfall. The FBI's investigation expanded rapidly as Crockett's evidence opened floodgates to additional whistleblowers who came forward with information about other corrupt judges, attorneys, and officials throughout the federal system. For Anthony Trenga personally, the consequences were swift and devastating. Federal prosecutors charged him with 23 counts including bribery, money laundering, conspiracy, and violation of the Foreign Agents Registration Act after discovering his connections to overseas intelligence operations. His wife was arrested on related charges, his assets were frozen, and his luxurious Virginia mansion was seized as proceeds of criminal activity. The man who had laughed at Congresswoman Crockett was now facing up to 75 years in federal prison and the complete forfeiture of everything he had accumulated through decades of corruption. The ripple effects throughout the federal judiciary were unprecedented as Crockett's revelations triggered the largest judicial ethics investigation in American history. 7 additional federal judges were placed under investigation for similar corruption schemes. 12 prominent attorneys were disbarred for participating in bribery conspiracies, and over 200 court cases were ordered to be completely relitigated. The Morrison and Forster law firm, where Trenga had maintained his corrupt partnerships, was raided by federal agents and ultimately disbanded after criminal charges were filed against 15 of its senior partners. Perhaps most importantly, Crockett's exposure of the corruption network led to immediate legislative action as Congress passed the Federal Judicial Transparency Act with overwhelming bipartisan support. The new law required real-time financial disclosure for all federal judges, created an independent oversight board with criminal prosecution authority, and established mandatory sentences for judicial corruption that could not be reduced through plea bargaining. Legal experts called it the most significant judicial reform legislation since the creation of the federal court system itself. 1 year after that explosive courtroom confrontation, Anthony Trenga was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to avoid a trial that would have exposed even more devastating details about his criminal empire. The man who had mocked Congresswoman Crockett's legal abilities was led away in handcuffs, his judicial pension stripped, his reputation destroyed, and his name forever associated with one of the most spectacular downfalls in American legal history. His final statement to the court was a pathetic attempt at an apology that legal observers described as too little, too late, and completely unconvincing. For Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the victory represented far more than just bringing down one corrupt judge. It proved that meticulous preparation, unwavering courage, and absolute commitment to justice could still triumph over even the most entrenched corruption. Her methodical 6-month investigation became required study at law schools across the country, teaching future attorneys that real power comes not from position or connections, but from competence, integrity, and the willingness to stand up for what's right regardless of the personal cost. The most powerful testament to the impact of that day came from Maria Santos, the military contractor whistleblower whose evidence had started Crockett's investigation. When I heard Judge Trenga laughing at Congresswoman Crockett, I thought justice was dead in America, she wrote in a letter that went viral across social media. But watching her calmly destroy his criminal empire with nothing but facts and evidence showed me that justice isn't dead, it just requires people brave enough to fight for it, no matter how powerful the opposition. The empty federal courthouse where Trenga once ruled like a king now serves as a reminder that in America, no one is above the law when citizens like Jasmine Crockett have the courage to hold them accountable. If this story of preparation defeating corruption inspired you, smash that like button and subscribe for more content showing how knowledge and determination can bring down the most powerful abusers. Comment below with the moment you found most satisfying. Was it Trenga's mocking laughter or his silent humiliation? Because when we refuse to let the powerful escape justice, we all become stronger defenders of the democracy that belongs to all of us.